God damn it. What the hell do you think you're doing? Filthy. Disgusting. That's something you don't touch. You serve it. You watch it. But you never hold it. Ethan Callahan's voice cut through the dark like broken glass. He stormed into the nursery, his steps sharp against the hardwood. In 2 long strides, he was in front of her. Alyssa Parker, his hand reaching down with unyielding force. Before she could even explain, he yanked Sophie from her arms. The sudden absence of weight and warmth made Alyssa's breath catch in her throat. "No, please," she blurted, her voice shaking. "She just fell asleep. She wouldn't stop crying." But Ethan's face was set in stone, his jaw clenched as he held the child like a possession that had been wrongfully taken. The air between them was heavy, carrying both the faint scent of baby powder and the sharp, cold edge of his fury. Alyssa Parker hadn't planned to fall asleep on the wooden floor. She'd only meant to soothe Sophie for a few minutes, waiting for the baby's breathing to steady before placing her in the crib. But exhaustion stacked on exhaustion, day over day, week after sleepless week. When her eyes closed, she was still aware of Sophie's tiny hand curled in the fabric of her sweater, an unspoken plea for the comfort she could not find anywhere else. On the floor, the thin rug held a bit of warmth. The glow of the moon-shaped nightlight pooled over the baby's flushed cheeks. Alyssa had cradled Sophie against her like a coal ember in the heart of winter, her back resting against the crib, the rest of the world fading to the edges. Ethan's arrival shattered that quiet. His command had not been a request, it was an order. And yet, in the moment Sophie was lifted from her arms, the baby's wail tore through the air as if some invisible thread had been snapped. "Shh, it's okay," Ethan muttered, awkward in the way of a man who knew how to read balance sheets, but not the rhythm of a child's heart. Sophie only cried harder, sharp, panicked cries that scraped at the walls. Her small hands clawed the air, searching for what she'd lost. The cheap shampoo scent, the worn fabric, the steady heartbeat of the woman who had carried her through the storm. "Let me hold her again," Alyssa said, her chest tight. "I'll put her down after." "Just 2 minutes." Ethan's eyes flashed with something between irritation and confusion. He looked ready to argue, but Sophie's cries climbed higher, sharp as breaking glass. The perfect, controlled room was unraveling under a force he couldn't manage. Attachment. "Fine," he muttered, his voice rough. 2 minutes. Alyssa gathered Sophie back into her arms, moving with the instinct that had settled into her bones. She closed the circle of her arms, her hand patting a slow, steady beat against the baby's back. 1, 2, 3. The cries stumbled, then ebbed into whimpering, then quiet. Sophie tucked her face into Alyssa's shoulder, the mingled scent of warm milk and baby sweat fading into the knit of her sweater. In less than half a minute, the room's rhythm returned. Ethan watched, his expression unreadable at first, the hard line of his brow easing just slightly. Control was his language, and here was a language he had never learned. 2 minutes passed. Sophie's eyes closed. Alyssa kept her in her arms a moment longer before laying her gently in the crib. The baby's tiny hand still clung to her thumb, reluctant to let go. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice lower, almost uncertain. "I shouldn't have raised my voice." Alyssa nodded. Apologies didn't erase what happened, but they cracked a small window open for air. She adjusted the blanket over Sophie. The invisible line between employer and employee was still there, but she could feel its edges shifting. "I wasn't sleeping," she said quietly. "She only settles when she feels someone close. The floor keeps the warmth better than the chair." His eyes flicked to the rug, seeing the indentation her body had left. A flicker of shame passed over him. The numbers, The quarterly growth, the next investor round for Haven, suddenly they all seemed theoretical compared to the sight of this woman on the floor, keeping his daughter's world steady. "Have you had dinner?" he asked abruptly. She shook her head. "Not hungry, thank you." She slipped out of the room, closing the door softly, leaving Ethan by the crib. The moon-shaped light glowed on the wall. Alone with his daughter, he let the silence speak, telling him truths he had avoided all day. The hallway in the Callahan house was long and cold, like a five-star hotel stripped of its warmth. Abstract paintings, crystal vases, deep rugs that swallowed the sound of footsteps. Alyssa passed the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. She remembered her first day here, arriving just as rain began, suitcase damp, shoes worn thin. The house manager had walked her through the rules, schedules, restricted areas, the folding of towels, the meticulous record of every bite Sophie ate. Everything spotless, but airless. The kitchen door swung open. Ethan stood there, his pace slower now, as if speaking another language entirely. "I was too harsh," he said, his second apology in under an hour. "It's not something I'm used to. But Sophie, she's been having trouble sleeping. After—" He stopped, lowering his voice. "After her mother left. It's been chaos." Alyssa leaned lightly on the counter. "I understand. Children don't have words for fear. They speak in body heat and breathing patterns." He nodded, avoiding her gaze for a moment, then looked back as if deciding not to hide. "Sophie, she calms down for you. If there's a process you use or anything you need, tell me." She thought for a moment. "I need uninterrupted time with her when she's upset. And here," she glanced toward the vast, perfect living room, "sounds echo longer than they should. I need a corner that feels ordinary for Sophie. Floor cushions, a rug, a warm lamp." "That's all?" "That's all. And a promise," she said, "not to move her when she's calm in someone's arms, no matter who's holding her." The words hung between them. Ethan pressed his lips together, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll have it arranged. And I know you're not here for me. I heard what you said." "I'm here for Sophie," she said simply. "Get some rest," he told her. "I'll sit with her tonight." "No," she said gently. "If you're there, you'll act on instinct. Let me stay until she's settled. Then I'll sleep on the sofa. The floor's fine." He glanced at the living room rug again, remembering her there moments ago. "Not the floor," he said. "I'll have them bring a mattress to the sofa. We can do this right, and still keep it warm." In his short call to the staff, Alyssa stood quietly. Small adjustments were the start of bigger changes. She had learned that in the shelters. A curtain could make a woman sleep through the night. Changing bath time could ease a child's panic. Where warmth existed, there was a chance. She returned to Sophie's room, settling into the rocking chair, pulling the thin blanket over her knees. Ethan's footsteps faded down the hall. The baby stirred once in the night. Alyssa soothed her with a light pat, never lifting her from the crib. By morning, a mattress waited on the sofa, with a folded quilt on top. Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thanks for last night," he said. "I've never seen her calm that fast." Alyssa took the cup, the heat soaking into her fingers. "A low shelf for her things," she added, "so she sees what's hers. And a board for notes about what she likes and fears. I don't want last night's lessons lost on the next shift." "Done," he said, a faint, almost shy smile on his lips. "For the others, and for me." They sat in the quiet, neither mentioning that the night had begun with an order and an insult. The house had its own memory, and sometimes it chose to remember the right thing. The arms that had been a harbor for a storm of tears. Before the sun cleared the neighboring building, Alyssa checked on Sophie. The baby slept on her side, lips parted in some dream. Alyssa adjusted the blanket, her hand brushing the crib rail. Ethan broke the silence. "Tonight, if you don't mind, I'd like to try holding her while you're there. I want her to know me in a safe way." "All right," Alyssa said. "But if she cries past her limit, I'll take her back. Not to win over you, but to keep her calm." He nodded. "You're not trying to win." "You've just made this house somewhere a person can breathe." When Alyssa left the room, she heard his steps remain by the crib. She didn't turn, but she could picture him standing there, learning to stay close without taking, listening for the breathing of his own child. The first night at the Callahan house ended not with a slammed door, but with quiet changes, a mattress on the sofa, a promise not to move a sleeping child, and the small truth standing in the center of the room. Sometimes, to keep a whole house warm, all it takes is one person willing to sit on the floor with a child until dawn. The Callahan house woke slowly, like a great vessel coming to life. Silence first, then the faint hum of the heating system, then footsteps muffled by deep rugs. The winter light through the tall windows was sharp and pale, catching the silver edges of picture frames and the gleam of untouched marble counters. Alyssa had been up before all of it. She always was. She moved through the nursery in soft socks, changing Sophie's diaper with practiced hands, humming under her breath. The baby blinked up at her, still slow from sleep. Alyssa's fingers brushed through the fine hair at Sophie's temple. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. This was the easy part of her day, the part before the rest of the house noticed her existence. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, he didn't enter. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching as Alyssa buttoned Sophie into a pale blue onesie. "She didn't wake up once last night," he said, his tone more factual than appreciative. "She stirred," Alyssa corrected. "But she settled. Sometimes it's not about picking them up. It's about letting them know someone's there." He gave a curt nod, as if logging this detail like a line item in a report, then glanced at his watch. "I'll be out most of the day. Meetings. Sophie's schedule is on the fridge." She knew. She'd memorized it her first week. When he left, the air in the nursery felt different, less tense, but still not warm. Alyssa set Sophie in her playpen, handing her a soft cloth book. The baby's small fingers explored the edges, her eyes tracking the shapes. Alyssa sat on the floor beside her, not towering over her like so many adults did. "You don't need much, do you?" she murmured. "Just space to breathe and someone who doesn't mind sitting here." Downstairs, the housekeeper moved through the kitchen in near silence, the clink of dishes, muffled. In the Callahan household operated like clockwork, efficient, invisible, polite without warmth. It was a system that kept everything perfect and everyone distant. Alyssa carried Sophie to the sunroom mid-morning. She'd claimed this space early on. It was the only room that didn't feel like a showroom. The light here was softer, filtered through cream curtains. A rug, one she'd unrolled from a closet, covered most of the tile floor. A basket of toys sat in the corner. She lowered herself to the rug with Sophie in her lap. "We'll make this our place," she said. "They can have the rest of the house. This one's ours." For nearly an hour, she built towers of blocks for Sophie to knock over, catching each giggle like a rare gift. When the baby's eyes began to droop, Alyssa carried her upstairs. The hallway outside the nursery was empty, quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the central heating. She laid Sophie down and stayed for a few minutes, her hand resting on the edge of the crib until the little body's breathing slowed. It wasn't until after lunch that the coldness of the house pressed in again. Ethan had returned, phone to his ear, voice clipped. He moved past Alyssa in the hallway without acknowledgement, disappearing into his office. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking toward the closed door. She'd learned that in this house, closed doors stayed closed unless Ethan opened them himself. In the kitchen, the housekeeper was packing away groceries. She glanced up at Alyssa, her expression neutral. "Mr. Callahan doesn't like too much noise in the afternoons," she said. Alyssa almost laughed. Sophie was a baby. Babies made noise, but she only nodded. "I'll keep her in the sunroom." It was easier there anyway. Later that afternoon, Sophie woke from her nap cranky and unsettled. Alyssa held her close, rocking slowly in the chair by the window. She felt the tension in the baby's body, the little fists pressing against her chest. "Shh," Alyssa soothed. "It's just you and me." Minutes passed before Sophie's breathing eased. Alyssa stayed put, unwilling to risk breaking the fragile calm. That was when Ethan reappeared. He stepped into the nursery, his tie loosened, phone still in hand. His eyes flicked to Sophie in Alyssa's arms. "I can take her," he said. "She's almost asleep," Alyssa replied gently. He hesitated. "I don't want her to get too attached." The words stung more than she expected. "Attachment is what helps her feel safe," Alyssa said, keeping her tone even. "Without it, she learns that comfort doesn't last." For a moment, they stared at each other. Then Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling his attention away. He stepped back, answering the call, leaving the room. Alyssa looked down at Sophie. "We'll just keep doing what works for you," she whispered. Evening came quietly. The city lights outside the tall windows began to glow, the winter sky deepening into blue. Ethan didn't join them for dinner. Alyssa ate at the kitchen counter while feeding Sophie mashed carrots, the baby's mouth opening like a small bird's. When Sophie was finally asleep for the night, Alyssa tidied the sunroom. She stacked the blocks, folded the small blanket, smoothed the rug. Ethan appeared in the doorway. For a moment he seemed about to speak, but instead he said, "Thank you," and turned away. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, Alyssa found a large box on the sunroom floor. Inside were floor cushions, a warm yellow lamp, and a low shelf. Exactly what she'd asked for. She ran her hand over the fabric of the cushions, feeling their softness. Someone had listened. Sophie crawled over, patting the box, her face lighting up when Alyssa set the cushions on the rug. The baby bounced on them, giggling. Ethan appeared behind them, watching the scene. "I thought this might help," he said. "It will," Alyssa replied simply. He lingered a moment, as if waiting for something else to be said, then nodded and left. Alyssa sank into one of the cushions, Sophie in her lap, and thought about how warmth worked in a house like this. It didn't rush in like a wave. It crept in, small and deliberate, finding its way past cold walls through acts so quiet they could be mistaken for nothing at all. Days turned into a quiet routine. Mornings in the sunroom, naps in the nursery, afternoons filled with small games and songs. Sophie's sleep improved. The dark circles under her eyes began to fade. One evening, as Alyssa read to Sophie from a worn picture book, Ethan stood in the doorway longer than usual. His gaze was softer. "You've made a difference," he said quietly. Alyssa closed the book, looking up. "She just needed someone to stay," she said. He nodded, almost to himself. "I've been absent, even when I'm here." There was no judgment in her silence, only the truth she carried in her work. Presence couldn't be faked. For now, That was enough. The first snow of the season had started just after dawn, a slow drift of white over the dark city streets. Alyssa watched it from the sunroom window while Sophie dozed in her lap, her head tucked beneath Alyssa's chin. The baby's breath warmed the hollow of her throat, and each rise and fall of the tiny chest felt like a quiet affirmation. Here, you are safe. When Sophie woke, she blinked at the window, then reached toward the falling snow as if she could touch it. Alyssa smiled. That's yours to look at, not to hold, she murmured. Some things you just keep in your eyes. It was later that morning after Sophie's nap when Ethan appeared at the doorway. He was dressed in dark slacks and a sweater instead of his usual suit, still formal, but less like armor. He carried his tablet under one arm. I need your opinion on something, he said. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. My opinion? Yes, he said simply. You've been working with Sophie for weeks now. You understand. Care in a way most people here don't. I'm developing something. An app. It's called Haven. She shifted Sophie to her other knee. What's it for? It's meant to connect caregivers and families to mental health resources, quickly, efficiently, support networks, counseling, even emergency response. He glanced at her, as though weighing how much to explain. I've been pouring money and time into it. But there's a problem. It's all corporate, polished. It looks like it belongs in a boardroom, not in someone's hands at 3 a.m. when they're desperate. Alyssa thought of the shelters she'd worked in, the parents who'd come in shaking and sleepless. She knew the weight of 3 a.m. Show me, she said. He sat beside her on the floor, an uncharacteristic choice, and unlocked the tablet. The Haven interface bloomed onto the screen. Clean lines, pale blue background, icons neat as soldiers. It was beautiful, but cold. It's fine, Alyssa said after a moment, if you're looking to impress an investor. But if you're trying to help a mother with a colicky baby or someone hiding from an abusive partner, this doesn't speak to them. His brow furrowed. What would? She looked down at Sophie, now tapping her fingers against Alyssa's sweater in some private rhythm. First, anonymity. Some people won't reach out if they think they'll be tracked. Second, plain language. No jargon. And third, she hesitated, resources they can use without leaving their house. Or without anyone else knowing they're asking for help. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Go on. An option to text instead of call. A quick quiet mode that changes the screen so if someone walks by, it just looks like a calendar. And local maps that don't just show clinics, but food banks, safe houses, legal aid. All in one place. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. You've thought about this before. I've lived it, she said simply. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, but recognition. I want you on the team, he said. Officially, as a user advisor. Alyssa blinked. I'm a nanny. You're a frontline expert, Ethan countered. You've seen the cracks in the system from the ground. My developers have never spent a night in a shelter. You have. That perspective is worth more than all their degrees. Sophie let out a small squeal, as if punctuating the statement. I'll think about it, Alyssa said, though her mind was already turning over the possibilities. That evening, Ethan asked if she'd join him in his office once Sophie was asleep. Alyssa hesitated at the door. She'd never been inside before. The room was warm from a gas fireplace, lined with shelves of leather-bound books. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. I had my lead designer make a mock-up based on what you said this morning. He turned the tablet toward her. The difference was startling. The colors were warmer, the language direct, the icons softer. human. This feels like it's for someone real, Alyssa said. That's because it is, Ethan replied. I want you to keep working with us. Even if you stay here with Sophie, we can work around your hours. She thought of the women at the shelter, of the way a single phone call or anonymous message could change the course of someone's life. She thought of how Sophie had clung to her on that first night, how safety had to start small. I'll do it, she said at last. Ethan leaned back, a rare smile tugging at his mouth. Good. Welcome to Haven. The days that followed felt different. Between feedings and naps, Alyssa took notes on the app. What worked, what didn't, what questions people might be too embarrassed to ask. She tested every feature herself, imagining the circumstances in which someone would use it. One afternoon, as snow thickened outside, Ethan joined her in the sunroom with his laptop. I've been thinking, he said. We could build a caregiver-to-caregiver forum, a place where people can share advice anonymously. Only if it's moderated, Alyssa said. Otherwise it turns into noise, or worse, it could be dangerous. He nodded, typing as she spoke. They worked in companionable quiet, Sophie playing on the rug between them. It was the first time Alyssa realized Ethan could be still in her presence without the air feeling heavy, but the house still had its silences. Some were comfortable, some were not. One night, after Sophie was asleep, Alyssa sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea. The housekeeper passed through, paused, then said, I've never seen Mr. Callahan spend this much time in the sunroom. Alyssa smiled faintly. Maybe it's the lighting. Maybe it's you, the woman replied, then moved on. Alyssa sat with that thought. She didn't want to imagine herself as a catalyst for anyone's personal transformation. She was here for Sophie, but she couldn't deny the subtle shifts. A softened tone, a question asked instead of an order given, the sound of Ethan's voice explaining her suggestions to his development team as if they were gospel. The first internal demo of the revamped Haven took place on a Friday afternoon. Ethan invited Alyssa into the conference call with his team. She sat in the sunroom, Sophie napping nearby, and listened as developers in other cities discussed her ideas as core features. When the meeting ended, Ethan's voice came through her earbuds. You did well. I didn't do anything but tell the truth, she said. Exactly, he replied. It was the first time Alyssa felt like she was more than the warmth in the cold house. She was starting to be the spark for something larger. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of pale winter morning when the city seemed to hold its breath. Alyssa was in the sunroom with Sophie, the baby's laughter tumbling out as she stacked blocks higher than her head. Each time the tower toppled, Sophie's eyes widened in delight before the giggle escaped again. Ethan was actually there for once, leaning against the doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't speak, but Alyssa could feel the faint hum of his presence, a little less guarded than before. Then the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, almost foreign in this part of the house. Alyssa glanced toward Ethan, who set down his coffee and went to answer. Sophie reached for another block, unconcerned. But the moment Alyssa heard the voice in the foyer, her hands stilled. A woman's voice, low, practiced, with an edge that carried even through the distance. When Ethan returned, he wasn't alone. Behind him was a woman in her late 20s, tall, with a mane of dark hair that caught the light like ink in water. Her coat was expensive, the kind of fabric that never saw rain, but her eyes, blue, sharp, moved restlessly around the room until they found the child. Alyssa, Ethan said tightly. This is Claire Morgan. Alyssa knew the name without needing to be told. Sophie's mother. Claire's gaze didn't linger on her. It went straight to the playmat. Hi, baby, she said, voice bright and strange in the quiet sunroom. She took a step forward. Sophie froze. Then, as if some ancient alarm went off inside her, she scrambled toward Alyssa, small hands gripping her sweater, burying her face in her chest. "Sweetheart, it's okay," Claire coaxed, crouching down. "It's Mommy." The child's whimper deepened into a full, desperate cry. Alyssa instinctively shifted, putting herself between Claire and the trembling weight in her arms. "I think—" Alyssa began carefully, but Claire's eyes snapped to hers. "You think what? That you know my daughter better than I do?" Ethan stepped forward, a warning in his tone. "Claire!" But Sophie was clinging harder now, her cries escalating, her tiny fists twisting in Alyssa's sweater. Alyssa could feel the pounding of the baby's heart against her own ribs. "I'm not trying to keep her from you," Alyssa said, voice steady. "But she's scared. Give her a minute." "I haven't seen her in months," Claire shot back. "Do you have any idea how that feels?" Alyssa's jaw tightened. She didn't say the obvious. Yes, she did. In 100 different stories from women she'd met in shelters, she'd heard what separation felt like. But those stories didn't erase the fact that Sophie was the one whose fear was filling the room right now. Ethan's voice cut in. "Claire, let's sit in the other room for a moment. Give her space." "I came here to see my daughter, not to have her hidden from me like—" "She's not being hidden," Ethan said sharply. "She's overwhelmed. If you push, you'll make it worse." For a long moment, Claire's eyes flicked between him and Alyssa, as if weighing whether to fight or retreat. Finally, she straightened, her voice tight. "Fine, I'll wait. But she's my child." Alyssa didn't answer. She focused on Sophie, murmuring softly, rocking until the sobs turned to hiccups. Half an hour later, Claire tried again. This time, Alyssa stayed nearby but didn't interfere, until Sophie's lower lip began to tremble. Claire's smile faltered, her hand dropping. "She doesn't even recognize me," Claire said, almost to herself. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "You left." "Claire." "I had to," she said sharply, then softer. I thought it would be easier for her." Sophie had turned back toward Alyssa by then, climbing into her lap with the certainty of someone who had already chosen her harbor. Something in Claire's face cracked, though she smoothed it over quickly. "Maybe I should go," she said, rising to her feet. No one stopped her. When the door closed behind her, Ethan stayed in the foyer a long time. Alyssa carried Sophie upstairs, settling her into the crib. Back in the sunroom, Ethan was still standing there, his expression unreadable. "She's going to come back," he said finally. "Probably," Alyssa said. "And when she does, Sophie will still need someone to make it safe." His gaze lifted to hers. "You think that's you?" "I know it is," she said simply. Over the next few days, Sophie was clingier, more easily startled. Alyssa adjusted her schedule, keeping the baby close, reading to her more, holding her longer before naps. One afternoon, Ethan paused outside the nursery door, listening to Alyssa sing a low, steady lullaby. When she emerged, he said quietly, "You didn't have to be here during all that. You could have walked away." Alyssa met his eyes. "I'm not here for what's easy." Claire did return, twice more in the weeks that followed. The second time, she stayed in the living room, watching Sophie from across the space, saying very little. The third time, she brought a small stuffed rabbit. Sophie accepted it, but still turned back to Alyssa for comfort. After that visit, Claire stood at the threshold, the toy still in her hand. "She loves you," she said, her tone unreadable. "Maybe more than she loves me." Alyssa didn't answer. Claire's fingers tightened around the rabbit. "I'll come back when she's ready." She left the toy on the table and walked out without looking back. That night, Alyssa found the rabbit in Sophie's crib. The baby had one arm draped over it, her breathing deep and even. When Alyssa turned off the lamp, she caught a glimpse of Ethan in the doorway. His eyes flicked to the rabbit, then to her. "She's choosing her own circle," Alyssa said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "And you're at the center of it." It began with a sound Alyssa almost didn't notice. A faint creak overhead, too heavy to be the house settling, too light to be construction. She was in the sunroom, stacking blocks with Sophie. When the second noise came, a metallic clink, like a latch being tested. Ethan wasn't home. The rest of the staff were downstairs. The rooftop terrace was supposed to be locked during the winter months. Alyssa's skin prickled. She scooped Sophie into her arms and moved toward the hall, ears straining. The baby fussed at being lifted away from her game, but Alyssa tightened her hold, her steps quiet. By the time she reached the stairwell to the rooftop, she saw it, light spilling in from above. The door to the terrace opened just enough for the wind to snake through, and a shadow moving against the pale sky. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the thrum in her chest. The figure turned. Ryan Mercer. He was Callahan Global's senior operations director. Sharp suit, sharper smile. He'd been at several meetings Ethan held in the house, always polite to Alyssa in a way that felt like he was noting her presence for later use. Now, in the brittle winter sunlight, his expression was different. Startled. Caught. "What are you doing up here?" Alyssa asked. His gaze flicked to Sophie in her arms. "Fresh air," he said easily. "Didn't think anyone would mind." "The door was locked," she replied. He shrugged. "Keys aren't hard to get." Before she could answer, a gust of wind rattled the railing. Sophie whimpered. Alyssa adjusted her grip, moving subtly to block the baby from the open edge. The terrace was high, the wind sharp enough to sting. "You shouldn't be up here with her," Ryan said, tilting his head. "I came up because the door was open," Alyssa said. "With Sophie in the house, I check things like that." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Dutiful. I'll let you get back to it." He slipped past her, the scent of expensive cologne trailing behind, and descended the stairs without hurry. That night, Ethan came home late. Alyssa waited until Sophie was asleep before telling him what had happened. "He said he was getting fresh air," she finished, watching Ethan's expression. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Ryan doesn't live here. He had no reason to be on the roof." "You think he was looking for something?" "I think," Ethan said slowly, "he's been looking for an angle. And if he's willing to wander into private parts of my home without asking—" He didn't finish the thought. Alyssa hesitated. "Sophie was unsettled after that. She clung to me the rest of the afternoon." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Then we'll make sure he's nowhere near her again." The next few days, Alyssa noticed things. Files left slightly out of place in the home office, the cleaning staff whispering about a missing access card. Once, while returning from a walk with Sophie, she saw Ryan's car parked down the street, engine off, windows dark. She mentioned it to Ethan that evening. "That's the third time this week," Ethan said grimly. "He's been trying to undermine me at the board for months. If he's willing to get personal, I need proof before I move." "Proof," Alyssa repeated. "I need someone he won't suspect to keep an eye out, someone already in the house." She understood immediately. "You're asking me to watch him." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to help me protect my daughter and the company. Ryan's smart. He covers his tracks. But he's arrogant. That's where he slips." Alyssa thought of the rooftop, of his too smooth smile. "All right," she said. "I'll keep my eyes open." The first opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Ryan arrived for a meeting with Ethan but lingered in the hallway after Ethan stepped away to take a call. Alyssa was in the kitchen, rocking Sophie, when she heard faint footsteps moving toward the back staircase. She followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Ryan headed not toward the meeting room but toward Ethan's private study, one of the few rooms with restricted access. From the corner, she saw him produce a key card, swipe the lock, and slip inside. Her pulse quickened. She took out her phone, snapped a photo of the half-open door with the time clearly visible, then another of Ryan inside, rifling through a desk drawer. Sophie stirred against her shoulder, and Alyssa stepped back into the kitchen before he emerged. When Ryan returned to the main hall, his expression was smooth as ever. "Afternoon," he said lightly, as if nothing had happened. Alyssa forced a polite smile. "Afternoon." That night she showed Ethan the photos. "This is enough to start," he said, his tone low. "But we'll need more. The board won't move on suspicion alone." Alyssa met his eyes. "Then we'll get more." From then on, her days took on a dual rhythm, caring for Sophie as always, and quietly noting every move Ryan made in the house. She noticed who he spoke to, how long he lingered in certain rooms, what papers seemed to vanish after his visits. It was a strange kind of vigilance, protecting the child in her arms while guarding the walls around her. One afternoon, as she sat in the sunroom feeding Sophie, she saw Ryan cross the backyard toward the side gate. She shifted Sophie to her hip and followed just far enough to see him hand a slim folder to a man in a dark coat. She didn't have a photo that time, but she remembered every detail. The way Ryan kept his face angled away from the house, the faint scrape of the gate latch, the man's quick departure. When she told Ethan, he exhaled slowly. "He's moving information off-site. That's dangerous for all of us." "Then we need to catch him in the act," Alyssa said. Ethan nodded. "And we will." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Alyssa stood by the nursery window, looking out at the cold city lights. Somewhere out there, Ryan was playing a game with stakes he thought only Ethan understood. But Alyssa knew better. Ryan had already stepped into her world when he opened that rooftop door. He just didn't know it yet. The boardroom of Callahan Global was built to intimidate. A long table of dark walnut stretched nearly the length of the room, polished to a mirror sheen. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, the morning light glinting off glass towers. On the far wall, a massive abstract painting, a swirl of black and crimson, loomed like a silent judge. Alyssa had never been here before. She'd seen the space only in photographs, and even then it had felt like a world that existed on another plane. Now she was standing at its threshold, Sophie in the safe care of a trusted staff member back at the house, her phone in her bag holding the photos and notes she'd spent weeks gathering. Ethan stood beside her. His usual calm had been sharpened to something like a blade. His suit was darker than normal, the knot of his tie precise, his eyes alert. "Remember," he said under his breath, "we're not here to speculate. We show them facts. Enough for the board to see the risk in keeping him." She nodded, fingers tightening around her bag strap. When they entered, conversations stilled. 12 members sat along the table, some familiar from brief encounters at the house, others complete strangers. Ryan Mercer was already there, seated halfway down the table. He looked up as they came in, and the faintest smirk touched his mouth. "Ethan," one of the older board members said, "we weren't expecting an audience." His gaze flicked to Alyssa. "She's here because she has information relevant to this meeting," Ethan said evenly. Ryan leaned back in his chair. "Information?" From the nanny? The word was laced with dismissal, but Alyssa kept her expression neutral. Ethan began. Over the past month, we've experienced a series of security breaches within my home office and on company property. Sensitive files have been accessed without authorization. One of those breaches took place in my residence, a restricted space. That's a serious claim, another board member said. Do you have proof? Ethan glanced at Alyssa. She stepped forward, placing her phone on the table. This was taken on January 14th at 3:42 p.m. Mr. Mercer entered the private study without permission using a key card not assigned to him. Ryan's smirk tightened. That could be anyone. I also have this, Alyssa interrupted, swiping to a second photo. Ryan inside the study, the drawer of Ethan's desk open, his hand inside. Murmurs rippled around the table. Ryan straightened, his tone smooth. I was retrieving a document Ethan needed. We're colleagues. You handed a folder to an unidentified man at the side gate 2 days later, Alyssa said, her voice steady. No record of that file exists in the archives afterward. Now the murmurs grew louder. That's a serious accusation, the older member said. It's not an accusation, Ethan said. If it's true. He produced a printed log from the security system showing the key card access history and laid it in front of the members. This card was assigned to an off-site storage facility. It's been used multiple times inside secure company areas over the last month, always when Ryan was present. Ryan's voice rose. You're twisting this. You've wanted me out since... What I want, Ethan cut in, is a company that doesn't bleed information to whoever's paying for it. We can debate my motives all day, but the fact is, our internal audit shows missing files that match the times you accessed restricted spaces. Silence settled. The weight of evidence was pressing down. Finally, one of the members cleared her throat. Ryan, do you have any explanation that fits the facts? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes flicked toward Alyssa, a flash of something darker than annoyance passing there. Recognition. I've given decades to this company, he said instead, his voice tight. If you're ready to throw that away because of a few photographs taken by household help, then you deserve whatever happens next. The older member looked toward Ethan. What's your recommendation? Termination of employment, effective immediately, Ethan said without hesitation. And a full forensic review of every system he's touched in the last year. The vote was swift. 8 in favor, 3 abstaining, 1 opposed. Ryan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. This isn't over, he said, his eyes on Ethan. Then to Alyssa, you've made an enemy you can't see coming. She didn't flinch. You were never invisible. Security escorted him out. When the room emptied, Ethan remained at the head of the table, his hands braced on the polished surface. Alyssa stood near the windows, watching the city below. You didn't have to speak up like that, he said after a long pause. Yes, she said, I did. He walked into Sophie's home and thought no one would notice. He thought no one would protect her. Ethan's gaze softened. The board sees you differently now. I don't care how they see me, she replied. I care that Sophie's safe, and that your company doesn't crumble because someone thought they could hollow it from the inside. For the first time that day, he smiled. Not the polite, guarded smile she'd seen before, but something warmer, like the first break in a winter sky. You've done more than you know, he said. That night, back at the house, Sophie was already asleep when Alyssa went to check on her. The stuffed rabbit Claire had left was tucked under one arm, but Sophie's other hand rested against the crib rail, the same spot Alyssa had touched on that first night. She stood there a while, letting the quiet wrap around her. The confrontation at the boardroom was over. but she could still feel Ryan's parting words lingering like a shadow at the edges of the room. Ethan appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "She sleeps better when you're here," he said. "She knows she's safe," Alyssa answered. He hesitated, then said, "I'd like you to keep working with Haven, not just as an advisor, but as someone who shapes the way it grows. We need people who see the ground level, people who won't back down when it matters." Alyssa looked back at Sophie. "I'll do it, but not for the board. For her." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why you're the right one." The first donation came from her own pocket. It wasn't much, just enough to cover the first month's rent on a narrow storefront in East Harlem. But Alyssa wanted the foundation to have her fingerprints from day one. She didn't want it to start as a favor from Ethan, or as some branch of Callahan Global's charity arm. It had to be hers. The space was nothing like the pristine rooms of the Callahan house. The paint was peeling in spots, the floors were scuffed, and the windows rattled when the subway roared past underground. But there was warmth in the way sunlight angled through the dusty glass, falling in golden stripes on the floorboards. "This is it," Alyssa murmured to herself, standing in the middle of the room. She could already picture the low shelves lined with donated toys, the bulletin board pinned with job postings, the corner piled with cushions where women could sit without feeling like they were on display. When Ethan stopped by that afternoon, he didn't comment on the chipped paint or the uneven floor. He just stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, scanning the space. "You're really doing this," he said. "I told you I would. I thought you might change your mind." Alyssa turned to face him. "I'm not here to build something that looks good on a report. I'm here to build something that keeps people from falling through the cracks." He nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "A few repairs, a working heater, and someone who can fix the lock on the front door without charging more than the rent." He smiled faintly. "I can make a call." "I can handle it," she said quickly. "You can support me in the background, but this needs to stand on its own." His smile lingered, softer this time. "Understood." The weeks that followed were a blur of long days and longer nights. Alyssa painted walls herself, scrubbed floors, and sourced secondhand furniture. She contacted friends from the shelters she'd worked at, asking for donations, baby clothes, blankets, kitchen basics. Word began to spread. A woman showed up one afternoon with a bag of unopened diapers. Another brought in canned goods. A retired teacher offered to run evening literacy classes. Alyssa kept the name simple, the Warm Floor Foundation. She wanted it to speak to the kind of comfort that didn't require luxury. Just a place to rest without fear. One evening, she sat cross-legged on the bare floor, sorting through a stack of donated children's books. Ethan walked in carrying takeout. "You've been here since morning," he said, setting the food down. "There's a lot to do before we open," she replied. "But it's coming together." He handed her a container. "Eat. Then tell me your plan for the launch." She took a bite before answering. "No big ribbon cutting, no press release. Just an open door and a sign that says we're here. The people who need us will find us." Ethan studied her for a moment. "You're not making this easy for me to brag about you, you know." She smiled. "Good." Opening day was quieter than she expected. Only 3 people came. A young mother with a toddler, an older woman looking for a safe place to spend the afternoon, and a teenage boy asking about part-time work. But to Alyssa, it was enough. She sat with the mother over coffee while Sophie, who she'd brought along for the day, toddled nearby with the toddler. She gave the older woman a blanket and a place to rest in the warm corner by the radiator. She promised the boy she'd keep him in mind once the center grew. That night, she locked up feeling the weight of both the work ahead and the purpose already taking root. Still, Ryan's parting words at the board meeting haunted her. "You've made an enemy you can't see coming." One afternoon, as she was restocking the supply shelves, she noticed a man in a dark coat lingering across the street. He wasn't looking directly at the foundation, but something about the way he shifted his weight, glancing toward the building every few minutes, set her nerves on edge. When she mentioned it to Ethan later, his expression tightened. "I'll have someone keep an eye on the place." "I don't want security scaring people off," she said. "This isn't about intimidation," he replied. "It's about making sure you're not blindsided." She didn't argue, but the unease stayed with her. By the third week, the warm floor foundation was already stretching beyond what Alyssa had imagined. The small pantry was half empty by Friday evenings. The cushion corner was almost always occupied. She started a simple bulletin board where people could post jobs, housing leads, or just words of encouragement. One night, after Sophie was asleep, Alyssa sat at the kitchen table in the Callahan house with Ethan. She spread out a notebook filled with handwritten notes and sketches. "This is what I want to add next," she said, pointing to a page. "A small workshop area. We could run skills classes, resume writing, basic budgeting, even childcare training." Ethan scanned the page. "You're turning this into a full community hub." "That's the point," she said. "A warm floor is the first step, but people also need the tools to stand on their own." He leaned back, nodding. "You know, the board was skeptical when I brought you into Haven. Now they're asking when they can meet you." "I'm not interested in becoming a board project," she said, closing the notebook. "I want to keep this grounded. People can smell a PR stunt from a mile away." "That's why it works," he said quietly. Late one evening, as Alyssa was closing up the foundation, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. When she answered, a woman's voice came through, faint and shaky. "Is this the warm floor place?" "Yes," Alyssa said gently. "You're safe to talk." There was a long pause. "I don't have anywhere to go tonight. He said if I came back." "You don't have to go back," Alyssa said. "Come here. We'll find you a safe place for the night. Can you get to 125th and Lexington?" The woman's voice broke. "Yes." "I'll be here," Alyssa promised. When the call ended, Alyssa stood in the dim light of the entryway, the keys still in her hand. This was why she'd done it. Not for recognition, not even for the satisfaction of proving herself, for moments like this, when the promise of a warm floor was more than a metaphor. By the time she got home that night, Sophie was already asleep. Ethan was in the study, the fire casting gold light over his desk. "How was the day?" he asked. "Busy," she said, and told him about the call. He listened without interrupting, then said, "You're building something that's going to outlast both of us." Alyssa shook her head. "I'm just making sure no one feels like they have to sleep on the cold ground." "That," Ethan said, "is how legacies start." It was a Tuesday morning, gray and damp, when the letter arrived. Alyssa found it in the small stack of mail waiting on her desk at the warm floor foundation. Most envelopes were familiar, donation receipts, utility statements, but one was different. Heavy paper, no return address, her name written in precise cursive. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting steady but faint. "My name is Margaret Lee. I used to work for Callahan Global. I have information I believe you, and Ethan Callahan, need to see. They ruined my life to keep me silent. If you care about truth, meet me at 6 p.m., corner of 92nd and Amsterdam. Come alone. No phone number, no email." Alyssa read it twice, her thumb tracing the grooves of the pen strokes. Something about the measured hand and the choice of words, "ruined my life," made her believe it wasn't just desperation. It was a warning. When Ethan arrived at the foundation later that afternoon to drop off a box of donated supplies, she handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression tightening. Margaret Lee. She worked in internal compliance more than 20 years ago. She resigned suddenly. Or at least that's the official story. My father's name came up in whispers around that time. Whispers about what? A cover-up, Ethan said. A safety incident in one of our overseas facilities. I was barely in college, but I remember overhearing arguments behind closed doors. If Margaret has proof after all these years. He trailed off. She asked me to come alone, Alyssa said. That's not happening, Ethan replied immediately. If she's telling the truth, she's in danger, and so are you. Alyssa folded the letter. If we show up together, she might not talk. Ethan studied her, then sighed. All right. You meet her. I'll be nearby. The rain had picked up by the time Alyssa reached the corner of 92nd and Amsterdam. The streetlights glowed in the mist, casting halos over the wet pavement. Margaret Lee was easy to spot, thin, in a navy coat that had seen better days, a knit hat pulled low over her forehead. She held a worn leather satchel close to her side, her eyes darting every few seconds as if measuring the shadows. You came, Margaret said when Alyssa approached. Her voice was low, roughened by years and caution. I read your letter. Margaret glanced past Alyssa toward the street. Are you alone? Yes, Alyssa lied. She knew Ethan was watching from a parked car half a block away. Margaret opened her satchel and withdrew a thick folder bound with an elastic band. These are copies. I've kept the originals in a safe place. Safety inspection reports, internal memos, financial transfers, all tied to a plant in Malaysia that collapsed in 2001. 10 people died. The board buried it. Some of those people are still there. Different faces, same control. Alyssa took the folder, feeling its weight. Why now? Margaret's gaze flicked to the rain-slick street. Because they're about to do it again. Different projects, same shortcuts. I've seen the signatures. Ethan's on the right side of this, but they'll try to bury him too if he stands in the way. A sudden gust of wind rattled the street signs. Margaret flinched. I can't be seen with you too long. If something happens to me, make sure this goes public. Don't let it die in a file drawer. Before Alyssa could ask more, Margaret stepped back, melted into the rain, and was gone. Back in the car, Ethan drove without speaking, his jaw tight. At a red light, he finally said, If this is real, it could take down half the board. Then it has to see daylight, Alyssa said. They'll fight like hell to keep it buried, and they'll come after you for holding it. I've been a target before, she said quietly. I can handle it. He glanced at her. Not alone. That night, at the Callahan house, they spread the documents across the study desk. Inspection reports with forged signatures. Emails with subtle but clear instructions to alter findings. Wire transfers to shell accounts. Ethan tapped one page. That's my father's signature, and 2 others still on the board today. Alyssa felt the cold weight of the truth settle between them. If Margaret's right, people died because of this. They did, Ethan said. And if the current project goes forward the same way, more will. Alyssa closed the folder. Then we stop it. But we do it in a way they can't smother. Ethan looked at her sharply. What do you have in mind? We take it to the public. Not as a leak from Callahan Global, but as a story about the people it hurt. Margaret's face, their names, the truth they've carried for decades. That's dangerous, he said. So is doing nothing, she replied. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still smelled of it. Alyssa carried the folder back to the foundation, locking it in a file cabinet in her small office. Every few minutes, she caught herself glancing toward the window, scanning for that lingering figure in a dark coat. For now, the papers were safe. But she knew the moment she opened them to the world, safety would be the first thing to go. And she was ready for that. The camera was steady. That had been Alyssa's first requirement. She didn't want anything slick or staged, but she also couldn't let this be dismissed as some grainy anonymous video. Margaret's story needed to be seen clearly. Every line on her face, every tremor in her hands. They filmed in the sunroom at the Warm Floor Foundation. The winter light was soft through the curtains, casting a kind of quiet dignity over the small space. Margaret sat in the chair they'd placed against the wall, her navy coat buttoned, the worn leather satchel at her feet. "You can stop any time," Alyssa told her. "If it feels too much." Margaret nodded. "I've been silent for 22 years. Too much was 22 years ago." The red light on the camera blinked on. Alyssa sat just off frame asking the questions. "Can you tell us your name and how you were connected to Callahan Global?" Margaret's voice was steady. "My name is Margaret Lee. I was a compliance officer from 1996 to 2002. I left after uncovering safety violations at a plant in Malaysia. 10 people died in a collapse that should never have happened." She spoke for 20 minutes. About the falsified inspection reports. About being told to adjust her findings. About the day she was escorted out of the building, her career in ruins, because she refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement. "I kept copies," Margaret said, resting a hand on the satchel, "because I knew someday the truth would matter again." When the recording ended, Alyssa took a long breath. "We'll get this out as soon as possible." Margaret nodded. "Once you do, I'll have to disappear for a while, but I'll be watching." They uploaded the video to a dedicated site that couldn't be traced to Callahan Global. Then Alyssa sent the link, along with scans of the documents, to 3 investigative journalists she trusted from her shelter work, reporters who'd covered stories no one wanted to hear. The first article hit within 24 hours. Callahan Global accused of burying safety violations. 10 dead in 2001. Factory collapse. By the next morning, it was everywhere. News sites, social media, even the morning TV shows. The headline was always paired with Margaret's face, her voice steady as she described how the signatures on those reports were forged, how the families of the dead were paid to stay silent. Ethan called her from the road. "The board's in emergency session. Half of them are calling for an internal review. The other half are trying to spin it as a smear campaign. And you?" "I'm telling them the truth. Which means they'll probably come for me next." "Then we keep going," Alyssa said. "The more light, the less room for shadows." By the 3rd day, the pressure was breaking things open. 2 board members resigned, citing personal reasons. A former plant engineer in Malaysia came forward, confirming Margaret's account. But the pushback came too. Anonymous calls to the foundation, some just breathing on the line. An envelope slid under the door with nothing inside but a clipping of her face from a newspaper, a red X drawn across it. Ethan insisted on adding more security around the building. Alyssa didn't argue this time. One evening, she found Margaret sitting in the sunroom, looking out at the street. "They're not going to forgive you for this," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Alyssa replied. "I'm asking for change." Margaret's gaze softened. "Then you'd better be ready to keep standing, even when they start trying to knock the floor out from under you." "I've been on cold floors before," Alyssa said. "I know how to stay on my feet." The board's emergency session that Friday was closed to press, but Ethan called her the moment he stepped out. "They're splitting apart," he said. "Some want to fire anyone connected to the scandal. Others want to investigate everyone, including me. I told them if they wanted to survive this, they needed to start by acknowledging the truth publicly." "That's not going to be easy for them," Alyssa said. "It's easier than what comes next if they don't," he replied. That night, Alyssa stayed late at the foundation, sorting new donations. She could feel the shift in the air, not just from the storm she'd helped unleash, but from the way people now looked at her when she walked down the street. Some with admiration, some with wariness. By the time she locked up, she knew the next days would decide whether Margaret's truth would force real change, or just burn out as another scandal buried by time. And she was not about to let it be buried. The press conference was Ethan's idea, but the way he framed it surprised everyone, especially Alyssa. It was held in a modest hall downtown, not in the gleaming Callahan Global headquarters. No long table of executives, no towering backdrop of logos. Just a single podium, rows of folding chairs, and the low hum of cameras being readied. Alyssa sat off to the side, hands folded in her lap. Sophie was on her knee, her small fingers tangled in Alyssa's sweater. The toddler's hair had grown thicker, her eyes curious as they swept over the unfamiliar crowd. Ethan stepped up to the podium. The murmur in the room quieted. Over the past month, he began, this company and my family have been confronted with truths we can't ignore. Lives were lost because corners were cut, people were silenced, and when those stories surfaced, we had a choice: bury them again or face them. His gaze swept the room, steady. I chose to face them. He spoke of Margaret Lee, of the documents she had kept for over 2 decades, of the systemic failings that had let such things happen. He didn't shield the board from blame, but he didn't make it a personal vendetta either. It was about responsibility. And there's another truth I want to share today, he said, his tone shifting. Because in the middle of all this, I've seen what real accountability looks like. Not from a board member, not from a shareholder, but from someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. He turned toward Alyssa. The cameras followed. This is Alyssa Parker. She's not a case I took on. She's not an employee I'm here to protect. She is my partner, in protecting my daughter, in building something that matters, and in standing for the truth when it's dangerous to do so. The work she's done with the Warm Floor Foundation is her own, and I'm proud to support it, not as charity, but as collaboration. Alyssa felt Sophie shift in her lap, the child's eyes turning toward Ethan's voice. Ethan's final words were simple. The people in your life who stand beside you when it's hard, those are the people who build your future. That's what Alyssa has done for me, for Sophie, for this company, and I want the world to know it. The applause began softly, then swelled. Afterward, reporters swarmed. Alyssa deflected most questions, focusing instead on the foundation. Sophie clung to her until they finally made it out into the cool evening air. On the sidewalk, Ethan fell into step beside her. You handled that well, he said. You ambushed me, she replied, but there was no heat in it. You deserve to be seen, he said simply. The weeks that followed were quieter. The board initiated a full audit. Margaret went into temporary seclusion, her safety coordinated through contacts Alyssa trusted. 2 more resignations came through, each accompanied by a carefully worded statement about priorities and health. Ryan's shadow lingered. There were rumors he'd taken a position overseas, consulting for a competitor, but he never came near the house again. The foundation grew. The cushion corner was almost never empty. A small shelf by the front door held Sophie's latest contribution, a set of wooden blocks she'd donated after deciding there were enough toys at home. One rainy afternoon, Alyssa found Ethan there, crouched on the rug, letting Sophie stack the blocks on his knee. You know she's going to start remembering things soon, Alyssa said from the doorway. Ethan glanced up. Like what? Like who was there for her, and who wasn't. He nodded slowly, looking at the child in front of him. Then I guess I'd better keep showing up. Spring came late that year. On the first warm day, they took Sophie to the park. Alyssa spread a blanket on the grass while Ethan chased the toddler across the playground. The laughter, Sophie's high and unrestrained, Ethan's lower but just as real, carried on the breeze. When they finally collapsed onto the blanket, Sophie curled between them, chattering in the half-words of a child still finding her sentences. Alyssa listened, smiling, the sun on her face. Ethan looked at her over Sophie's head. You know, you could move in here officially. Make this house your home, too. Alyssa hesitated. And what would that mean? That we stop pretending you're here only because I hired you. That Sophie knows this is permanent. Alyssa brushed a strand of hair from the toddler's forehead. We don't have to change titles for her to know that. Maybe not, Ethan said. But I'd like to make it clear. For both of you. That evening, back at the house, the three of them stood on the back porch. The sun was sinking, spilling gold over the yard. Sophie clutched the stuffed rabbit in one hand, Alyssa's fingers in the other. Ethan leaned on the railing, watching the light fade. Families aren't always blood, he said. No, Alyssa agreed. They're the people who stay. Sophie yawned, leaning into Alyssa's side. Alyssa lifted her, the child's small head resting against her shoulder, eyes half closed. Ethan stepped closer. Not in the careful, measured way he had in the early days, but with the ease of someone who understood his place. They stood together until the sky deepened into dusk. No walls between employer and employee, no invisible lines, no scripts. Just the quiet weight of shared days and the unspoken promise of many more. In the warm air of that evening, Alyssa realized something. The house was no longer cold, and for the first time the future didn't feel like a fight to survive. It felt like something they could build together. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. Stories like Alyssa's remind us that family can be built in unexpected ways, and that the courage to stand for what's right can change more than just one life. Your time and presence here mean more than words can say. Until our next story, take care, and keep believing in the quiet power of those who choose to stay.